I think I shared with you a few weeks back that this year is shaping up to be a banner year for the celebration of the sacraments. We have more baptisms than we have funerals this year, which is wonderful. That is a sign of growth. And we also have more baptisms this year than we have ever had in the history of the Parish of the Resurrection from 2009. It's wonderful, it's tremendous, and it brings me great joy. I love celebrating baptisms. We've also had quite a few weddings. I've already celebrated 10 of them this year, and I got another one next week, and they're not over yet. So it's absolutely tremendous. But being the kind of person that I am, I like to go back over time and trace trends and look at stats and all of those kinds of things. And when I'm looking at my almost 11 years as a priest, I wanted to track how many of these various sacraments have I celebrated throughout my life. Now, funerals are not a sacrament, but they win the day. I've done pretty close to 1,000 of them, which is a lot, okay? Baptisms come in second. And they're not nearly as many as the funerals, about 500, which is still pretty amazing. But what kind of shocked me, although it didn't really shock me because I know that I haven't celebrated many of them, is the number of weddings. I've celebrated under 100 of them in my 10 years as a priest. Now this is quite different than trends even 20 years ago. Marriages used to be quite popular. Most people in this life got married. And now we're seeing, not just in the church, but in society, a steady decline of people who are getting married. And when we look at the stats too, for society as a whole, the divorce rate is over 50%. So there's something in crisis here. Now, when we look at this, when we think about how important marriage is, as Catholics who believe very strongly about the beauty and dignity of marriage, our little antennas should be going up and saying, what could be amiss here? And when we hear the gospel today, we know that there's nothing new under the sun. Marriage has always been a difficult reality. And I'm telling you this as obviously someone who's not experienced marriage. I'm a celibate priest, but I come from marriage. I've been around marriage my whole life, and I've seen a lot of what works, a lot of what doesn't work, a lot of the pains as well as a lot of the joys. And so I'm not completely, uninformed about this. But I do think that those of you who are in marriages, you know more intimately and experientially what I'm talking about. Marriage is hard work. And there could be many different reasons why it seems that people are not entering into marriage, or the marriages that they do enter into are not working out. I know in my family, most of the people who have gotten married over the last 10 to 20 years are almost all divorced at this point and are on to second marriages. Nobody enters into marriage with an escape plan, thinking that that's going to happen. Everybody, I think, for the most part, enters into it expecting that this is going to be a lifelong, permanent commitment of a man and a woman giving themselves to each other and giving themselves to God. But life happens, and things end up falling apart. And the question then becomes for the church, who has accompanied people on their journey of marriage and throughout their married life for 2,000 years. What do we do about this? What do we do to make sure that marriages are strengthened? And what do we do when the unfortunate reality happens that marriages tend to fall apart? The teaching of Jesus in our gospel today can at first hearing sound more like bad news than good news. And that's because of the Pharisees. The Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus. They're always trying to trap him. But they're trying to pit him against the law of Moses. And in the law of Moses, it was pretty clear that divorce was a possibility, right? And it had to be initiated by a man, of course, right? And he would, if his wife was caught in adultery or in some other kind of similar sin, the man could write a bill of divorce and dismiss her, and she'd probably end up in some sort of jeopardy as a result of that. And so the Pharisees, trying to pit Jesus against Moses, try to trap him today. And they say, well, Moses said this, but you, Jesus, seem to have a different teaching about marriage and family. So how do you reconcile that? And Jesus doesn't play their game. He doesn't care about their trap. He just speaks to them very plainly. And he says, listen, Moses gave you the possibility of divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. You weren't ready yet for this robust teaching. But I'm going to teach you this, that marriage is for life. When one man and one woman come together in marriage, there is nothing that can separate them, nothing that can tear them apart. We hear that in our gospel today. And if somebody divorces his wife or some woman divorces her husband and marries another, they commit adultery. Now that's terrifying because we see this all around. People that we love, maybe even ourselves. This is a reality that we're facing. And so we can put on sort of the panic mode and say, oh my goodness, what do I do? This means that maybe I or they are out of harmony with Jesus' teaching. I might as well just give up. And sometimes that has happened. A couple of years ago, I got called to the deathbed of someone. We'll call him John. And John wasn't interested in seeing me, but his children wanted me to see him. Because years earlier, John, who was a good practicing Catholic, he and his wife got divorced. And subsequently, he remarried. And somebody told him that he was excommunicated. Now, that's not true. John was never excommunicated. But that entered into his heart and mind, and he fermented this anger and bitterness to the church and to God for the rest of his life. And so when I got to his deathbed, and his kids didn't tell him I was coming, he's not real happy to see me. But they told me why. And so, I put on my big boy boots and had a conversation with John and said, John, we can fix this. There are solutions. And we did. And John died reconciled to God. My friends, the grace and power of Christ sets the bar very high. But God knows that we need a lot of help to get up to that bar. And when we look at marriage, which is one of the fundamental building blocks of society, we recognize that it's going to need a lot of help, but also a lot of mercy. One of the things that I have in my background, having studied canon law, is I've worked a lot with people who have experienced failed marriages and who want to enter into another marriage with somebody else. And so they come to the church to begin this process of an annulment. An annulment, some people think, is Catholic divorce, which is not true. An annulment, what it is, it's a declaration of nullity, which goes back and looks at the beginning of somebody's marriage and the time before the beginning of their marriage, looks at two people, and they say, was there some antecedent cause that would have prevented either person from truly giving consent to enter into this marriage? Sometimes it's immaturity. Sometimes it's a psychological problem that we didn't know about. Sometimes it's an addiction that was not made known. Sometimes it's some sort of personality trait that was withheld, an essential trait that was withheld from the other partner. And so what the church does is it looks back at that and says, yeah, look, there was an impediment here. There was a lack of full consent to enter into marriage. And for that reason, when the couple tried to come together, they weren't able to. And so the declaration of nullity is not that the marriage is ended. The declaration of nullity is that it never really came into being in the first place. Now, a good way to think about this, a good metaphor, is making a loaf of bread. As Catholics, we believe that marriage is like making a loaf of bread. You take flour and you take water. They're two very different elements from each other. And then you mix them together and you create this new kind of thing in such a way that you can't take the flour back out of the water. And hopefully, if you're paying attention, you've invited God to bring his yeast into this so that you have a nice loaf of bread. But sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes the flour that you add wasn't right. You know, there were at different points during the Industrial Revolution and other places when manufacturing was really getting off, that companies, flour companies, would lace flour sacks with sawdust. They'd put sawdust in there so that people, they would make more profit, and people wouldn't really know the difference. But what they found is that people were getting sick as they're making this bread that's filled with sawdust. They're not even knowing about it. They're not getting nourished by this bread. And I thought, you know, this is a really apt example of how sometimes things can go wrong. Sometimes you have somebody with all of the good faith, all of the right intentions. They bring their sack of flour, so to speak, to marriage, but they don't realize that there's a bunch of sawdust in there. And so when you go to mix it, right, on the wedding day, and you bring that flour and that water, and you put it together, it certainly makes something that looks like bread and smells like bread and kind of tastes like bread, but is not really bread. And then a couple of years later, it's making you sick, and you wonder what went wrong. It doesn't have to be malintention. It doesn't have to be someone just being an awful human being, although that does enter into our marriages. But really, I think the breakdown of a lot of marriages is that something essential was missing from the beginning. And the church wants to help people to identify that so that they can move on with their lives and maybe, hopefully, if they'd like to, enter into a true marriage where they can bring the flour and the water, and the two can become one, and what God joins together, no one will separate. So, a public service announcement. If you or anybody that you know is dealing with something like this in their life, maybe you're on to a second marriage and you never got an annulment, or you're dealing with some sort of kind of residual guilt over an early marriage or something, reach out, come and talk to me. There are solutions. We've always been able to find a solution for any issue. And we got to be real about marriage. It's tough. And sometimes the reason that a marriage isn't working is because there's been too much flour and not enough water, or too much water and not enough flour. The ratios are off. And so sometimes we can help to diagnose that and get those ratios back together. And sometimes that's all it takes. But the reality is that when we hear these hard teachings from Jesus, and they are hard, our initial instinct to say, no, I don't believe that, that's coming from the world. And the world's values change all throughout time. We can't follow those, right? We can recognize that good people with good intentions are following those. But Jesus gives us something really robust, really awesome, and really beautiful, and it's worth fighting for. I'm going to put her on the spot. Bernice and Tinky just celebrated 70 years of marriage. 70 years. That's amazing. And I'm sure it wasn't a cakewalk. I'm sure that it took a lot of sacrifice and a lot of looking back at the ratio, how much flour, how much water. But this is an institution that is worth preserving. It's an institution that's worth building up. It's one that's worth fighting for. And so when we see these problems, we don't want to panic, nor do we want to ignore them. We want to enter into them. We want to deal with them with God's grace and with the example of people who have fought the good fight and have showed us that it's possible. I look out here and I know many of you. I see wonderful marriages, not without their difficulties, but wonderful marriages. I see many of you who, like my own parents, weren't able to make it work, and it ended in divorce. But through the mercy of the church and through good reason have come to see that there was something wrong from the beginning, and that didn't make marriage possible at the time that it was attempted. And I see others who are struggling with their marriage right now, maybe, and not sure what to do or where to go. Don't keep it to yourself. And don't go looking for help on Facebook. Reach out. Reach out. This beautiful, beautiful sacrament is worth defending and fighting for. I want more marriages. I want more people fighting for this awesome sacrament. I want more people taking the risk, and it is a risk. Whenever you enter into anything with another person, it's going to involve a risk, but it's worth it. And we have the beautiful teachings of Jesus in our church to help build up this sacrament. So let's commit to a few things today as we're celebrating this Holy Mass and hearing these words of Jesus. One, we got to pray. We got to pray for everybody who is married. We pray for vocations to the priesthood and for our priests all the time. Sometimes we've got it easier than our married couples. Pray for those who are married, whether it's been 70 years or 70 minutes. Pray for them. Think around your family. Think about everybody who you know that is married. Pray for their marriage. Ask Our Lady and St. Joseph to pray for their marriage, that God will strengthen it up. Pray for those who you know are struggling. And if you have an intimate enough relationship with them, reach out and ask if there's something that you can do. Or if you're even more comfortable, ask if they'd be willing to come and talk to one of us. Be very happy to help them through. And look at those in your family and in your life who have not been able to make it and have really struggled, and their marriages have kind of fallen apart. Pray that they will know that the church and God has not abandoned them, that they are not excommunicated, that they are not sectioned off to the margins, that they are still wanted and beautiful and full members of the church, and that there are some solutions that can help them to fix the issues that they're dealing with. Let's commit ourselves to this prayer and this action, that you and I can be great followers of Jesus, setting the bar high, but recognizing that it is only by God's grace that any of us will ever get there.